Hey everyone, Jakinto here. With patch 9.0.5 recently released, you're probably wondering what Blood Death Knight Legendary you should be running now. In this video, I'll be going over all the patch 9.0.5 changes to the Blood Death Knight Legendaries. I'll be covering the actual changes themselves, which legendaries are viable, and which legendaries are optimal for different types of content. So as you can see on the screen, I do have the patch notes open, and everything to do with the Blood Death Knight is highlighted in white here. So we'll start with the top here with Pheromones. Pheromones now grants 10% haste instead of 8% while standing inside your Death and Decay. 2% extra haste might not seem like a lot, but it is a 25% buff to this legendary, which is a good buff. We can have a 66.6% uptime on Death and Decay if we're using it on cooldown, and even more than that if we get good Crimson Scourge procs. This means that we'll be able to get a high uptime of that 10% haste if we're able to stand in the Death and Decay for the whole time. This buff to Pheromones does make this legendary somewhat enticing, and we'll look into that a bit later. Now on to the next legendary buff, which is the most interesting of these changes, and that's to Crimson Rune Weapon. Crimson Rune Weapon now causes Dancing Rune Weapon to generate 5 Bone Shield charges, and reduces the cooldown of Dancing Rune Weapon by 5 seconds, up from 3 seconds. Now this change to Crimson Rune Weapon is really huge. Having that 5 Bone Shield stacks come up right away when you pop Dancing Rune Weapon really saves you a lot of Mirror Ends that you'd otherwise have to do. The cooldown reduction time from 3 seconds to 5 seconds is huge as well. Bone Shield stacks have an internal cooldown of 2.5 seconds. That means as long as you're being hit consistently every 2.5 seconds, you're able to lose a Bone Shield stack, and therefore knock 5 seconds off of your Dancing Rune Weapon. From my testing, that means you'll be getting Dancing Rune Weapon back around every 50 seconds. And that's down from Dancing Rune Weapon's cooldown time of 2 minutes, so this legendary really reduces the cooldown of Dancing Rune Weapon. I'll go in depth of this legendary as well a little bit later. The next legendary change is a Vampiric Aura, which now increases the duration of Vampiric Blood by 3 seconds and grants 5% leech. Now this change, although it's a buff, it is pretty minor, and it's likely not going to put this legendary into a mainstream position where we see it all the time. Keep in mind that this legendary does make it so your party members get 50% of Vampiric Blood's effectiveness, so maybe something fun to play around with in a party, but it's not going to be one of the top legendaries out there. The final legendary buff we have is to Gorfine's Domination, which now grants 45 runic power when Vampiric Blood is used. This means that when you use Vampiric Blood, you'll have enough runic power for another Death Strike. It's a nice buff, but not enough to really put it into mainstream play. Now that we've looked at all of those 4 legendary power changes, let's look at which legendaries are viable. It's important to note the distinction between viable and optimal. Viable means that you're able to play this legendary successfully, so you're able to get through a raid boss with this legendary successfully, or you're able to do a certain Mythic Plus dungeon successfully. For an optimal build, we're choosing the best legendary for the type of content that we're doing. So if we're looking at which legendary powers are viable, they're all really viable. You can pick any of these legendaries, even the ones that don't seem to do much, and you can get through all the content just fine. You can even do high level plus and high level mythic raiding with any legendary. You might get some weird looks if you're using an off legendary, but you're able to do it. So if you're someone who doesn't really care about optimization and you like a certain type of build better than another, definitely go for that. Now we'll talk about which legendaries are optimal and are considered the best legendaries currently in patch 9.0.5. So prior to this patch, we only had 2 legendaries to really choose from to optimize. That was Brindare's Might and Superstrain. And in most cases, Superstrain pulled ahead. And between these two, this is still the case. Brindare's Might will net you more runic power than Superstrain, but Superstrain is usually the better option due to its throughput. With patch 9.0.5, we saw 2 legendaries in particular that got some nice buffs and emerged to potentially being optimal. The first one of these is Pheromones. Now Pheromones isn't going to be optimal for every covenant. The only time you really want to try out Pheromones for an optimal build is if you're running the Night Fae Covenant. And this is because of Death's Due replacing your Death and Decay. So looking at the Night Fae Covenant here, Death's Due also got a nice buff. When you use an ability that costs a rune within your Death's Due, you gain 1 stack. So now with these buffs, each stack grants you 2% damage reduction and strength, up from 1%. The stacks also go up to 4 instead of 8, so you're able to get to maximum amount of effectiveness in half the stacks. So Pheromones only works in optimal builds with Night Fae because you're always going to be dropping your Death's Due on cooldown. Death's Due does more damage than your Death and Decay, and it'll give you a whole bunch of increases, especially if you're running Pheromones. So if you're Night Fae, Pheromones is something to keep in mind. Now onto that big changed legendary, Crimson Rune Weapon. So we did go over those changes, but remember additionally, we do get 40% rune regeneration when Dancing Rune Weapon expires for 10 seconds. This means that if we're being attacked consistently, we do get that 40% rune regeneration every 50 seconds. In a Mythic Plus dungeon, you'll realistically average about 1 minute per Dancing Rune weapon because you will have a bit of downtime when you're not being attacked, therefore not losing any Bone Shield stacks. Having 1 minute Dancing Rune weapons means that you can pretty much use it for every pack, and that makes it very powerful. With the 5 Bone Shield charges you get, along with the Rune regeneration, you're able to spam a lot more Heart Strikes, which leads to more damage and more runic power. So now we've narrowed the optimal legendaries down to 4. Crimson Rune Weapon, Brindara's Might, Superstrain, and Pheromones. We already mentioned that Brindara's Might did fall behind Superstrain even prior to this patch, and it didn't receive any buffs, so Brindara's Might will fall behind these 3. Pheromones we mentioned only really works if you're running Night Fae. So if you're running a Night Fae, you can definitely give this a try. However, even if you're a Night Fae, I believe that optimally Pheromones isn't the way to go. There's going to be times when you're not able to stand in your Death and Decay. Maybe you have to move out of mechanic, maybe you have to kite the mobs because you're taking too much damage, even with the damage reduction of the Night Fae Covenant ability. That being said, if you are able to keep standing in your Death and Decay / Death's Due, it is a really great legendary to have. So if you're Night Fae, you can give it a shot, but I do believe the next 2 legendaries are more powerful. So now it boils down to the top 2, Superstrain and Crimson Rune Weapon. And these are probably the 2 that you're debating on which one you should use. So let's do a comparison of these 2 legendary powers. To start this off, we'll look at the damage outputs of the 2 legendaries. So in Raidbots here, I did a simulation of what a 235 Crimson Rune Weapon legendary would look compared to a 235 Superstrain legendary. And this is using my item level of 224, Necrolord, Bonesmith, Soulbind, as well as my normal Mythic Plus build. So first we're going to look at single target here. If you're running the same build as me, you can expect somewhat around this damage if you're playing optimally in a boss fight. Since Crimson Rune Weapon does require a different slot than Superstrain, I did replace that slot just with the same item level and same stats that I had on my other slot. And as we can see, we do have Crimson Rune Weapon pulling ahead of damage slightly by 76 damage, which is 2.5%. Now keep in mind, this simulation is in an optimal setting. That means that I'm losing Bone Shield stacks every internal cooldown. So every 2.5 seconds, I'm losing a Bone Shield stack in this simulation. And that's not going to be the case in a Mythic Plus boss. There's mechanics you have to run from, there's downtime if the boss is doing a cast, and in these situations, you're not going to be losing Bone Shield stacks. Every time you're not losing any Bone Shield stacks, you're not decreasing the cooldown time of your Dancing Rune weapon, and this legendary does lose its effectiveness. Whereas with Superstrain, it's pretty much all passive as long as you hit Blood Boil. Those diseases will always be ticking on the boss. It's also important to note that Crimson Rune Weapon is a lot harder to play with and a lot harder to optimize than Superstrain. Superstrain is easier as all you have to do is hit Blood Boil and it's completely passive. All those diseases go on your targets. With Crimson Rune Weapon, you do have to use your runes effectively in order to get maximum amount of effectiveness from the legendary. You also have to keep an eye on your Bone Shield stacks. You don't want to waste those 5 stacks of Bone Shield that you get when popping Dancing Rune Weapon with this legendary. I'd probably do another video highlighting how you can use Crimson Rune Weapon effectively, but it is quite a bit harder than Superstrain. So for the most part, even though the sims show Crimson Rune Weapon ahead in damage for single target, I would say Superstrain will be ahead in most cases. Now we move on to the same simulation, except in an AoE situation where we have 5 targets around us. So in this AoE situation, Crimson Rune Weapon does fall behind, just by 13 DPS though, only 0.2%. But again, since Crimson Rune Weapon is a bit more finicky and harder to play with, these numbers will be going down. So overall, Superstrain will be quite a large damage increase. In addition, if you have to kite or be away from the mobs, you're not going to lose your Bone Shield stacks and it will lose its effectiveness. So overall, although it only shows a 0.2% increase for Superstrain, Superstrain will be quite a bit more damage in an AoE situation. So now that we compare the damage output of these 2 legendaries, let's look at the resource generated for these 2 legendaries. So Superstrain gives you resources in the form of runic power from Frost Fever. You'll probably get around 700 to 800 runic power for a 30-minute dungeon. Crimson Rune Weapon gives you a bunch of resources. It first gives you those 5 Bone Shield stacks upon activating Dancing Rune Weapon. Since you're gaining these 5 Bone Shield stacks, this means you don't have to use as many Marrow Rends and you can use those runes on Heart Strikes. And in turn, this will net you more runic power. We also have the higher uptime of Dancing Rune Weapon, as it'll be up twice as often. And during Dancing Rune Weapon, our Heart Strikes grant us 5 more runic power. So that's even more runic power that we're getting from that. In addition, we do get that rune regeneration for 10 seconds after Dancing Rune Weapon has expired. So we're getting 3 different types of resources back for this one legendary. Now just like with damage, getting that runic power back from this legendary is a lot more difficult to use than Superstrain. Superstrain, you get that runic power passively, you don't have to worry about much. But for Crimson Rune Weapon, it all revolves around using Heart Strike more. Overall, if we're looking at the runic power generated from these 2 legendaries is pretty comparable over the course of a Mythic Plus dungeon. Now finally, we'll look at the mitigation aspects of these 2 legendaries. So for Superstrain, the only mitigation it really gives is runic power, which you can use on those death strikes. which is always nice, but it's not on-demand mitigation. You don't know exactly when that runic power is going to come in, and it'll come in over time. Now for Crimson Rune Weapon, you know when you're going to be getting the effects of this legendary. You'll know when you get those Bone Shield charges, you can see when your Dancing Rune Weapon is going to be up next, and you know when your Dancing Rune Weapon expires, you're going to get that Rune Regeneration. Crimson Rune Weapons also means you get twice as many Dancing Rune Weapons as long as you're being hit consistently. So for double the amount of time, you'll have that 40% parry and the effects of Dancing Rune Weapon. And that's a very large amount of time. So comparing defensiveness from Crimson Rune Weapon to Superstrain, Crimson Rune Weapon is the better defensive legendary. So that's a full comparison between these two legendaries, but with that all said, which one should you be running? As we mentioned a few times before, it's important to know that Crimson Rune Weapon is more difficult to use. You do have to have quite a bit of knowledge of the Blood Death Knight spec in order to use it optimally. So because of this, if you're a beginner or you're still learning the Blood Death Knight spec and you're not really comfortable with it yet, I would recommend you using Superstrain for all content. Using Superstrain, since it's completely passive, you'll be able to learn the Blood Death Knight spec without any additives. Superstrain has been used to clear Mythic Castle Nathria and to clear level 23 and over Mythic Keystone dungeons. This shows that you can really go very far with Superstrain. Now if you're comfortable playing the Blood Death Knight, maybe you learn the rotation or you want a bit of a challenge, Crimson Rune Weapon is definitely an option you can choose. But when should you choose this legendary? Crimson Rune Weapon decreases effectiveness if you're not being hit consistently. In a raid boss such as Shriekwing, when you're only tanking the boss for 50% of the time, it's not going to be worth using Crimson Rune Weapon as you're not going to be able to maximize its effects. So in any raid encounter, when you're not consistently tanking the boss or some adds, I would recommend going Superstrain. But raid encounters where you're struggling to stay alive and you're being attacked consistently, maybe during Sludge Fist, maybe Huntsman Altimore, you can definitely go Crimson Rune Weapon. Now we're going to look at the legendary choice for Mythic Plus dungeons. So for Mythic Plus dungeons, you will be getting attacked by multiple mobs most of the time. And this is why Crimson Rune Weapon does become a great option to use. I would say in Mythic Plus, both Crimson Rune Weapon and Superstrain are both great options. Superstrain will give you more damage over the course of the dungeon. So if you're not worried about defensiveness or dying and you think you'll need a bit more throughput to time the dungeon, I would run Superstrain. However, if you know your damage output is going to be okay for the dungeon and you just need more defensiveness to get through it, I would run Crimson Rune Weapon. So as you can see, these are really situational. It's whether you want more damage output or you want to have more defensiveness. Personally, I will be switching between Superstrain and Crimson Rune Weapon, depending on the dungeon and the raid composition. If you're running with a Holy Paladin, your output is probably going to be quite good, and you can afford running Crimson Rune Weapon and losing a bit of damage. However, if your DPS is a bit low and your healer isn't pumping that much damage, or you just don't need the defensiveness, you can run Superstrain. And again, if you're a beginner or you're just learning the Blood Death Knight spec, I would recommend running Superstrain. You don't want to get into the habit of using Crimson Rune Weapon as a crutch, as it might get nerfed at some point, and eventually we won't have that legendary. So really solidify your rotation first, learn how to optimally use your runes and spend your runic power, and once you feel comfortable with that, you can delve into Crimson Rune Weapon. So if you're still waiting to craft a legendary or waiting to see which one to upgrade, I would upgrade Superstrain to max level first and then get Crimson Rune Weapon second. And that's everything I have to say about the patch 9.0.5 changes to the Blood Death Knight legendary powers. I hope this helped you decide which legendary to run for your build. If you have any questions about the legendaries, definitely leave them in the comments below, and I will be doing a video showing you how you can utilize Crimson Rune Weapon effectively. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I appreciate all of the support, and I'll see you in the next one.